Welcome to today's webinar, Improving Outcomes for Young English Learners, brought to you by NCSL. All lines have been placed in a listen-only mode to provide favorable sound quality during today's presentation. It is now my pleasure to turn the floor over to Allison May. Ma'am, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Welcome everyone to today's webinar. Good morning or good afternoon to each of you, depending where in the country you're calling from. My name is Allison May, and I'm with the Early Care and Education Project at the National Conference of State Legislatures, and I'm happy to welcome you all. I'm also joined on the line today with my colleague, Matt Wire, and Matt and I are very pleased with the turnout on the webinar and are sure that this presentation will be both interesting and informative to each of you. So from looking earlier this morning at our registration numbers, it looked as though we had approximately 27 states along with the District of Columbia on the webinar, many of whom are participants currently in our Early Learning Fellows program and a few who are alum of the program. So before we dive too deeply into the content, I'd like to familiarize everyone with the webinar platform. At the lower left corner of your screen, you'll see a chat box where you can post questions at any time during the webinar. And in order to build up a little comfortability right now, I'd ask that you all type into the chat box where you're calling from. Great. That's good to see all the different states coming in. Feel free to keep adding that. We like to just see who all is on the line, and I'm sure other people who are participating like to know the same. So today's webinar is part of our Early Learning Fellows program. And because the topic is important, we've opened registration up to others. Just to give you a little background for those less familiar with the Early Learning Fellows program, it began in 2011 and since then has had 6 cohorts, or roughly 150 fellows participate in the program. It's designed for NCSL members that are current or emerging leaders in the area of early care and education policy. And some of the main cornerstones of the program include building knowledge about new research and policy innovations, allowing participants to exchange ideas and solutions related to early learning, the opportunity gap, and many other issues, meeting, connecting, and learning from other legislative leaders, identifying action steps as part of a practical early learning plan for immediate use back in your state, and receiving the opportunity to speak and learn from leading researchers, policy experts, and other legislative colleagues. Just a couple other housekeeping pieces. On our webinar platform today, I just want to draw your attention to some helpful features. You'll see at the top right of your screen an icon that looks like a square piece of paper with a play button on it. And as you mouse over this icon, you'll see the words Show Me the Media Library. If you click on this icon, you will be able to access a copy of the slide deck that we're viewing today, along with a handful of reports that will be referenced during the webinar itself. So one of our goals over the next hour is to make this presentation as interactive as possible. So as a reminder, pose any questions you have in the chat box. We'll prioritize questions coming from fellows first, and we'll aim to answer as many of the questions as possible. So if we run out of time, we'll be sure to send electronic responses out to everyone that's on the line today. And at the end of the webinar, we'll have a short evaluation, and we would certainly welcome any feedback that you all can provide us because it really assists in building the best programming possible. This webinar is being recorded, and an archive copy will be available shortly. And with that, I will turn the webinar over to my colleague, Matt.
Thanks, Allison. So today we're going to hear a short background on who dual language learners are, where they are, and how they're faring in our educational systems generally. Next, we'll move into a presentation around best understanding data for this population to improve outcomes. We'll also hear about some legislation from Oregon and how that bill was built and passed, and then have a current early learning fellow reflect on the presentations and provide some legislative feedback. We will end with questions and a few logistic notes. So to begin, for our featured presentations, first we'll hear from Janie Tankard-Carnock from New America. Janie is a policy analyst with New America's Dual Language Learner National Work Group. Her work addresses policies and practices related to multilingualism, immigration, English proficiency, and educational equity. And before joining New America, she taught second grade in Baltimore, with half of her students having Spanish as their native language. After Janie, we'll hear from Danielle Winterhalter, who's former Chief of Staff for former Oregon State Representative Joe Gallegos. And before joining Speakeasy as the Director of Strategic Partnerships, Danielle worked as a political media consultant, campaign manager, and policy director. And after our presentations, we'll turn to Representative John Carney from Kentucky, who's the Kentucky House Education Chair and a current Early Learning Fellow, who will provide some reflections and talk about his current landscape in Kentucky. And after that, we'll have about 10 to 15 minutes for questions. So just to kick things off, I'm going to kind of brief everyone on this population we're talking about today, just so we can get our definitions clear from the get-go, and so that we're all on the same page. A dual language learner, or DLL, refers to children from birth through age 8 who are learning English in addition to their native language and are referred to as a subset of the larger English learner population. English learners, or ELs, on the other hand, refers to students who are between the ages of 3 to 21, enrolled in the pre-K through 12 educational system, who have a native language other than English, and are in the process of developing their English language proficiency. In this presentation, our presenters will be referring to this population generally as ELs for the sake of consistency and alignment, and we'll talk to more of the nuance of why this definition is going to be used. So just to get into some context across the country, the group of English learners has been growing steadily over the past 2+ decades and currently make up about 9.1% of all K-12 students nationally, but ranges significantly based on states. I know California has the largest, Texas, Colorado, and others have very high populations, upwards of 25%. But this group has also been growing rapidly in several areas of the country, especially the Southeast. And as you can see from the figure on the right, the states with the blue shade are states that are growing rapidly, and this is between the time period from 2004 to 2014. It's the most current data available. And the states with red have seen their populations kind of shrink a little bit. So I'll go to the next slide. And the top 5 EL growth states are South Carolina at 236%, Maryland 180, Mississippi 131, Arkansas 102, and Kentucky, where Representative Carney's from, is at 98%. So in looking at educational achievement generally, and our speakers will kind of touch on some more nuance with this, most people are aware that there are significant gaps across all subject areas. According to the National Association, or NAEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, English learners generally trail non-English learners by 36 points in reading, with the gap growing to 44 points by 8th grade. And that's not a percentage, that's a point total. And then using Colorado as a state example, gaps exist in English language arts ranging from 16 to 20% between the grades of 3 and 11. And in math, that percentage gap ranges from 13% to 17% in those same grades. And then in science, which is measured in 5th and 8th grade, gaps are present there as well. However, though, as Janie will kind of get into next, there's a lot more nuance to how the data is reported currently and how it's used for accountability compared to how it could be used. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to our first presenter, Janie Carnock.
Hey everybody, this is Janie Carnock. I'm a policy analyst at New America. We're based in Washington, D.C. And we just released 2 reports on this topic, actually, rethinking data for English learners in the ESSA era. Before I get started, just to echo sort of what Matt was talking about with the terminology, historically our team has used the term dual language learners to refer to this population with a focus on the earlier end of the range for children ages 0 to 8. But for the purposes of these reports, we decided to use the term English learners, so the broader range, as that aligns with the new federal law, ESSA, and is also the term used by a recent consensus report in the field. So that's why we're using that term here today, English learners. So these two reports that I just mentioned we released centered on this key challenge, which is how can leaders see if a school or a district is serving English learners well? And it is a really live question at the moment as states are finalizing their plans for ESSA and moving forward with implementation for that. Overall, the current view is somewhat blurry and, if not distorted in certain cases, of how English learners are faring. And that stems from a variety of misunderstandings and also limitations to how the data systems are designed for these students. And so that's going to be kind of the core of what I'm digging into today. Like I said, we released these two reports. The first is more of a theoretical framework, which offers 5 lenses, kind of the 5 key lenses that you need to be viewing data through to make sure you're interpreting the data accurately and validly. And the second is more of an illustration of those principles in Oregon's case, where they passed recent legislation there, and Danielle's on the line is going to talk more about that later as well. So in the first report, just to start, I want to clarify what data am I talking about. So I'm primarily talking about state-collected outcomes data. And for K-12 English learners, that takes 2 forms. That's their English language proficiency levels, which are tested by WIDA, ELPA 21, and then other states have their own developed tests. So that's the first kind of data point that I'm talking about. And then the second is the academic performance in math and reading that starts at grade 3. So PARC, Smarter Balance, and many other state-developed tests. Also, this has implications for the NAEP data that Matt referenced. So these are kind of the data points that I'm talking about. Really quickly, I just wanted to, this is a graph that's featured in the report showing you the different ELP, so English Language Proficiency Assessment by state. So over 35 states use WIDA, some use ELPA 21, and then the others, as I mentioned, are independent or state-developed. For academic, math and reading in grades 3 and 8, there's PARC, Smarter Balance, and then also the state-developed assessment. So there's these 2 sort of strands of outcomes data for these learners. So in the first report, I offer these 5 lenses for using EL data effectively. And I'm going to go through them today briefly, but I encourage you to check out the report for more detail on each of them. So the first one I wanted to talk about, and this is sort of the core design flaw in a lot of data systems for English learners, is the fact that the English learner subgroup is not static. So as you can imagine, students are entering, they're being identified as English learners. Ideally, they're improving over time, and then they exit the subgroup. This is problematic from a data standpoint because when they exit the subgroup, their data point is also exits the subgroup. And so it's sort of a catch-22 because as students become more proficient, they exit, and then that success is not necessarily reflected in a bump in the EL subgroup. And so easy remedy for this is to report all EL outcomes disaggregated by former and current ELs, so taking a more longitudinal view to kind of solve that catch-22 problem, and some states are moving towards that. Relatedly, some states have created an EverL group to track the entire group of current and former ELs over time for their entire K-12 experience. And so this graph shows, using NAEP data, and it's very common to see a graph like this. You'll see the ELs and the non-ELs. So ELs is in the greenish and non-ELs in the purple. And it's a massive gap. But if you look at the former ELs, you see that former ELs can often perform on par, if not outperform, non-ELs once they've exited the subgroup category. So if you're only looking at the current EL group, some researchers have referred to it as the gap that can't go away. Because as soon as as I mentioned, as they have success, they exit out. And so it's really critical to take that more longitudinal approach to the data so that you're having a more complete and accurate sense of how this population is doing. The second principle that I wanted to note is learning the language takes time, but not forever. So on average, learning the language, the research suggests takes about 5 to 7 years on average. And this reality is really important to keep in mind when you're looking at reclassification data. So the percentage of students that have exited EL status each year. And a lot of times you'll see the media or state leaders, they'll framing the reclassification data in a way that you want to have more and more kids reclassified as fast as possible. And that's not necessarily the goal. The goal is not to reclassify all English learners every year. That's not the goal, because there's really, as I have in my second bullet point, there's really a Goldilocks nature to exiting students. And so you don't want to create these incentives to rush students out of the subgroup category. You want to exit students at a sweet spot of not too fast, not too soon, but when it's just right for them to be able to thrive in a mainstream setting. So typically the reclassification data, I would recommend using extreme caution in interpreting it, just because you don't want, the goal is not necessarily to have an extremely high percentage of that or to drive up that percentage as high as you can get. That said, monitoring and reporting EL2 after 5 to 7 years, so after a fair window of time have not exited, is a good idea, just to get a sense of which students are sort of languishing in that subgroup. Is it an instructional issue? In some cases, is it a learning disability issue, or what's going on? So some states have looked towards a long-term EL subgroup category and reported that out as a fair sense of, okay, after a fair amount of time, which students are not exiting. The third principle is ELs at different stages progress at different rates. So there's a widely noted rule in the academic literature that lower is faster, higher is slower, which means that it's harder on average for English learners to make as much English growth at higher grades and at higher English levels. So for example, a second grade English learner that enters at, say, a level 2 on WIDA is typically going to be able to make a lot more growth than an 8th grade student who entered at, say, a 4 on WIDA. So there's this lower is faster, higher is slower rule that's really important to keep in mind when you're tracking English language progress. And several states under ESSA are using growth models that account for these contributing factors, like initial English level and grade level, recognizing that that plays a key role in how much growth a student can be expected to make year to year. The fourth principle is that English skills impact academic performance, which is sort of a common sense point, but I think it often gets lost in the discussion. Is, for example, if you consider a student that has taken, is an English learner and has taken a math test and done really poorly, do you know, is that because they don't understand the math concepts, or is that because there was a language barrier? And so when you're looking at the academic outcomes, you can't really disentangle the two before certain English proficiency levels. Before certain levels, it's impossible to get a valid reading of their academic performance. It's, in the paper I talk about, it's about, using WIDA data, it's about a level 3 for math, at which point the academic data becomes valid, and about a level 4 in reading, at which point the academic data becomes valid. So before that, you really can't draw meaningful inferences, because again, these students are defined as students that we are expecting not to perform in the same way as non-ELs academically. So in general, use academic achievement data with extreme caution, so that graph of the NAEP data that shows that non-EL bar and then the current EL bar is, I would say, is sort of misleading. And it kind of couples with that first principle, which is the revolving door nature of the subgroup. It's really impossible, the way we've collected the data, to close that gap. And then instead, I would say emphasize academic growth models, where students can grow year to year and they're not expected to make this one-size-fits-all proficiency bar that's really impossible developmentally for them to meet. And the last point that I think is really critical to highlight is that poverty affects most DLs and as a result, their educational outcomes. So around 70% of English learners in the country grow up in poverty. And I think that's really important to consider when we're talking about this population and diagnosing root causes. And so reporting demographic need data alongside outcomes data is really critical to bringing awareness to some of these structural opportunity gaps and resource gaps that are affecting how successful districts and schools are with these students. So that was kind of a quick drive-by of all those different lenses, and I encourage you to go back in the report if you're curious about certain ones and dig into them a little bit more deeply. And with that, I'm going to pivot to the second report, which Danielle will also be able to share her insights on, which focused on the a new piece of legislation that was passed in Oregon that leveraged data in some of the ways that I've just been talking about for English learners. So in Oregon, they passed new legislation in June 2015. It came with new funding and was described by Governor Kate Brown as a watershed moment for the state's education system and placed exclusive focus on boosting outcomes for English learners. Kind of the backstory here, and here's a map of Oregon. And so Oregon had been experiencing a lot of population growth, similar to the story in many other states. You can see there's this population is concentrated around the Portland area, Salem, mostly Spanish-speaking Hispanic families, and as well as refugee populations and also Native American populations. So as I said, the number of English learners was rising very rapidly. Reform had been building at the local level from the leadership of a group of superintendents. And as a result, the Oregon Department of Education came together and released this English Learner Strategic Plan in 2013. And then advocates were really pushing for more for legislative action and kind of codifying these ideas with new funding as well. And so I spoke with several people in Oregon, and one advocate had this to say about the law, which was, overall, we didn't have a clear understanding of where dollars were going and whether or not they were having an impact. So to kind of link into the theme of the first report that I was talking about, there really was this sense that there was a lack of clarity and that they couldn't tell what was going on. We're spending money on these students, but we're not sure what effect it's having on the outcomes, was sort of the premise of the conversation. And so what did the law require? It required an advisory group to redesign the data metrics that would identify the lowest performing English learner districts in the state. And those lowest performing districts would then develop an intervention plan with the department. The department, with the new funding that came with the law, would provide support to selected districts for 4 years. And then if after those 4 years, the districts did not meet their goals, the department would be able to intervene and direct district spending. The other piece of this legislation was that the department would publish a comprehensive standalone English learner report every year, which is really unique for the state. No other subgroup has this sort of exclusive report that places a great deal of transparency for this population. And so when the advisory group members were rethinking the data points that they wanted to use, they used a combination of outcomes as well as needs for English learners. So outcomes including English language growth, graduation rates, academic growth, post-secondary outcomes, alongside this needs index, which focused on poverty, homelessness, migrant status, mobility, these different factors that are also very important to keep in mind. And so then they looked at the intersection of those two variables. And so really they focused on the fourth quadrant in the graph, which was where it's the highest need, lowest outcome districts. And that's where they decided to target their new funding from the law. So really quickly, to recap the strength of this data approach, I would say they took a very longitudinal view. As I mentioned earlier in the first report, all of their metrics factored in both current and former ELs. So they took, like I said, a longitudinal view that has a more complete picture of how those students do even after they exit the subgroup. Second, they focused on growth. For current ELs, they used the academic growth metrics instead of an achievement bar that, like I said, would be impossible for students to meet. They used growth metrics. And finally, they really elevated the needs that are facing this population through this needs index data, which included student poverty, homelessness, these other factors that I mentioned. And so reflecting on those two, the first report and then the second report, which is more of the case study of Oregon, there's several potential state options here. First, publicly communicating a vision for EL equity with end goals in mind. So is it possible to accurately articulate the nature of achievement gap with the data collected for this population, and what would excellence for ELs look like? How would this be apparent in the data? I think those are really key questions for states to be able to answer and then put together in a really cohesive vision that anchors that conversation beyond a section in ESSA, but something that's separate and distinct. And Oregon is an example of a place that I think really articulated a vision for these students. Second, examine the validity of English learner outcome metrics with a diverse group of stakeholders. I think that was a real strength of Oregon's story, is they really brought to the table a diversity of perspectives from educators, researchers, advocates, statisticians, all together kind of grappling with, okay, how do we make sense of this data? Third, elevate demographic data to highlight needs of the EL population, which, as I mentioned, Oregon, I think, did really in a really important way. Number four, create an EL-specific report to publicly share data on English learner outcomes. So even after rethinking the outcomes to say, we're trying to make them more valid, we're trying to make them more accurate, then are those data outcomes available to the public in a transparent, centralized way that makes it very easy to access? I think the report in Oregon's case, you can already see sort of the effect that it's having on larger ecosystem. Even with media professionals are able to more quickly access that data. And so I've seen several stories coming out about both the strengths and weaknesses of how English learners are doing in the state. And that's really facilitated by this report, which makes those outcomes a lot more transparent for all public stakeholders. And then last, I didn't touch on this in depth, but fostering researcher-practitioner partnerships, I think, is a key piece. It's something that Oregon was able to leverage with some leader researchers in the English learner field, and they were able to use their insights to redesign these data metrics, I think, in really important ways. And so those are sort of the 5 key pieces that I'll leave you with. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Danielle, who will be able to provide her perspective from Oregon.
Well, thank you so much for that, Janie, and thank you everyone for having such great interest in this issue. It was certainly one of the pieces, probably the greatest piece of legislation I've worked on, and the ability to be able to work kind of on such a timely issue with so many passionate stakeholders from, as Janie said, so many different parts of the political and research and academic space was a real honor. So I am so happy to be here today to kind of share with you a little bit about what we did. And I was just one very small part of a very, very big, diverse, complicated puzzle. So I'll try to kind of paint that picture as we move forward. So I kind of today want to speak about a couple things. One, the background of the issue and kind of why it came to fruition in the legislature in 2015, the coalition of stakeholders that we put together, and then kind of offer a little political perspective into how we manage those diverse interests, and then tied it into kind of the systems of supports that the state had already started to put together at the Oregon Department of Education. A little bit about the politicking. I want to talk a little bit about the drafting of our concepts, some of the challenges as we put together the legislation, some of the successes, and then some of kind of the implementation challenges and successes that we've seen since passage of HB 3499. So this is a little bit of a recap, but as was mentioned, Oregon's English language learner population grew by 120% in the last decade between 2005 and 2015, leaving about 15% of Oregon student population classified as ELL. Of this student classification in Oregon in 2015, 49% of ELL students were not graduating high school. So we were kind of seeing this rapid growth, a system that wasn't able to support it, and as a result, this complete kind of failure of students. And I think the other piece that's important to mention is we also have incredibly passionate educators in schools and districts who want to be supporting these students. But when schools are dealing with so many other pieces of their puzzle, finding ways that we can help schools support these students and opening these conversations and making sure that kind of blame is never a part of this conversation, I think is a really, really important piece to start it's an important piece to focus on as you start to put together a stakeholder coalition to address this issue. So it's kind of a logistical background. The politics of this piece is this is becomes incredibly racially charged. You can get into rooms, and I'm sure many of you have experiences as well, that you can feel as it is almost educators against student advocates, against districts, against kind of departments. Even though everyone has the same goal and wants to support these students, the confusion as to why it isn't working already can inherently lead to this unintended blame game that kind of sets a really coarse tone if it's not kind of very carefully addressed from the beginning. So with HB 3499, we kind of set out to address three main pieces of ELL policy: uniform coding and budget transparency, a support and intervention system, and long-term strategic development. And within each of these subgroups, this focus came from the concerns from our stakeholder coalition. Our stakeholder coalition consisted of dozens of organizations, but kind of the main folks at the table throughout the entire process were the Oregon Educators Association, Stand for Children, the School Board Association, representatives of school administrators, APANO, which is an organization that represents Asian Pacific Islanders in Oregon, the Coalition of Communities of Color, and the Oregon Alliance of Education Equity. So those were kind of some of the folks that had representatives at the table for the 5 months that we worked together to put together this piece of legislation, although we received bounds of support from outside the smaller group. One of the problems we ran into in Oregon was that under the state school fund, students classified as ELL would receive an extra 0.5 weight to their school funding formula. But other than that 0.5, we had little consistency or accountability for how that was targeted and invested in said students' kind of learning outcomes. This meant that some districts who had, maybe a very small population of ELL students but great needs in their schools, didn't have systemic supports for said students in those classrooms, but still could use the money to kind of bolster other things schools needed. You theoretically, under the way the law was written, you could spend that extra 0.5 weight on light bulbs if you needed light bulbs in your classroom, which, if you're looking at the larger picture, if the school doesn't have light bulbs, then you're probably not teaching anybody very well. But for kind of this targeted success plan for ELL students, might not be the best use of funds for that individual student's learning outcomes. So we started with wanting to determine kind of a uniform coding and budget transparency that would require school districts to code and account systems of how to track how these ELL dollars were spent. A big piece of this piece of legislation was that we mapped out a roadmap of how we could build these successes, but we also saved a lot of the individual kind of devil in the details work for a work group that we put together that would kind of see this consistently through over several bienniums. And the goal of that was, one, not just to get something through the legislature, but knowing that, you know, as staffers turn over in a state legislature, as representatives turn over in a state legislature, wanting to make sure there was some consistency to make sure that this work was actually implemented. So you'll see kind of, if you dive into the work we did in Oregon, a very refined structure set out with the bill, but a lot of emphasis put on a work group of experts to determine, you know, what does that uniform coding and accounting system look like? And at that table also sits representatives from educator organizations, school organizations, Oregon Department of Education, student advocate organizations, and communities of color. So that was kind of the first piece. The second piece was the support and intervention system that asked the advisory group to determine how to rank what we then called focus and priority schools. So we determined that they would write a district annual report that would trigger the identifiers using the data qualifications that Jamie mentioned. We then divided these groups into 3 different pieces: districts with low progress indicators, districts with targeted indicators, and all other districts. So the other districts were classified as folks that were doing well, had good systems of support in place that would still be receiving support from the Oregon Department of Education as needed and as set out in that 2013 statewide school strategic plan that Jamie mentioned, but didn't necessarily need a specific allocation of targeted investments. So with our low yes? Matt, did you want to say something? Oh, sorry, thought I heard somebody cut in. With the districts with low progress indicators and our districts with targeted indicators, these folks would be set for a program review, which triggered a conversation with the Oregon Department of Education and the conversations with the districts. From that conversation, supports and targeted interventions would be triggered by this advisory group that we mentioned that would then tailor a program to each specific school and district as is indicated by the data. If after 4 years this piece, the schools were not improving, then ODE, the Oregon Department of Education, would take control of that 0.5 weight of funding from that school district and determine how to implement it to best focus on student outcomes. So essentially, a school district would have 4 years to try to work on these particular outcomes, and only then would ODE intervene to control any of the school funding. And that piece, that control of the weight of the school funding formula, was one of kind of the biggest contentious pieces with this legislation. We had a lot of advocates on this kind of communities of color and the student advocate side who wanted to see that 0.5 weight taken immediately upon passage of the legislation and be controlled by the Oregon Department of Education to start implementing this immediately. But then you had educators and districts who really wanted some time with some guidance to be able to learn how to build systems that could support these students long term, kind of not move all of that work into an emergency fund with ODE, but be able to set up systems in place that would allow ELLs to continue to succeed in these particular districts. And so that piece of the weight and that piece of who would take control and kind of the steps of how to target the low progress indicators and the targeted districts was kind of some of the most contentious pieces of putting this legislation together. And in order to do that, we took kind of that diverse coalition that I mentioned of educators, schools, and students, and started conversations the second month of the 2015 session. And it was not always the most comfortable room to be in. You also have a lot of these advocates working on a lot of other issues at the same time. Oregon has seen some challenging budget years. You're talking about not any, I don't think there are any states that are rolling in too much money for their schools, but you're kind of dealing with a really sensitive topic that also has this racial element. So we started these conversations in about February with this diverse group of stakeholders and tried to shepherd through the conversation as productively as possible for the next 3.5 months. We found that the stakeholder group really responded to clear pieces of communication being sent immediately following every working group. We also bribed people with lunch, but that's like neither here nor there. But what we would do just as an office is we would take kind of the contentious point of the day and write out the proposed solutions from each kind of organization into, sometimes it was up to like a 10-page memo. So when we continued the conversation, everyone was able to clearly see where everyone else was starting from. And through, compromise and time and organization, we slowly were able to reach consensus on every point. We also had the kind of political advantage that our speaker, Speaker Tina Kotek, is one of the most phenomenal legislators I've had the honor of working with and the pleasure of meeting. Now I run all around the country and get to work in a bunch of different states, but Speaker Kotek is really a phenomenal leader and made this a huge priority for her for the 2015 session, and having that leadership, having this as a priority for leadership helped us secure the $12.5 million allocation state school fund, helped other legislators pay attention, and also gave folks a lot to come together on. So main focuses, again, uniform coding, budget transparency, support and intervention systems, and then making sure that all of this work was not just for one biennium of attempted success. We set up kind of a system of long-term strategic development that would last far past a staffer who would be there for 2 or 3 years. And I would be happy to provide additional details on exactly how we structured this. If anybody is interested, please feel free to get in touch with me. But this kind of long-term working group, we slated into the bill. So we made these meetings mandatory. We made participants from certain kind of organizations mandatory. So we kind of forced the issue long after it is the hot, sexy thing of the session. Fiscally, we were able to fund this program, again, through Speaker Kotek's leadership, and by allocating $12.5 million per biennium of the state school fund. So setting up that funding stream with these policy recommendations and being able to marry those, I'm sure anyone on this call understands the weight and importance of that. We also, Oregon, people kind of think initially is hyper left, but we actually, Democrats only maintain a majority by about 15, was about 4 seats. So this really was a coalition, bipartisan piece of legislation, and we had our folks on the right really focusing on best known practices for budget transparency that we were able to roll into this, that also brought, your kind of fiscally conservative legislators more comfortable with kind of a targeted increase of certain dollars on specific programs, and layering in that kind of accountability platform was helped us get kind of everyone around the table. I think I've probably talked to you all for plenty long now, but as things move forward, we're seeing our working group in Oregon be able now to implement these pieces, and we're continuing to be able to hear voices from all aspects of the coalition, and seeing kind of the benefits of folks being slated into being forced to participate as this moves forward. So again, if you have any questions, please feel free to let me know. We'd love to talk about this and share more of our learnings, and really, again, appreciate everyone's time and attention to this issue. So with that, I'll pass it back to Matt.
Great. Thank you, Danielle, and thanks to Janie for all the great information. A few reports are available in the media library. It's the square with the play button on it. And just quickly, as someone who's completed their dissertation on English learner policy, Janie's Seeing Clearly report is a very succinct and clear summary of just a ton of English learner research. I'd encourage everyone to take a look. It really gets more into some of the things she was talking about. And we are here at NCSL to help you guys with any questions and follow-up. So quickly, I'll just pass it over now to Representative Carney for his comments and reflections. Representative?
Good afternoon, everyone. A lot of information there from our first two presenters, and a lot of great information. I'm going to thank, I hope it's okay if I just reference to Danielle, and then I've got notes everywhere, and Ms. Karnick. From Kentucky standpoint, as Matt mentioned earlier, I think we're around the 5th fastest growing state based on just in general population in English learners or English second learner students, and a lot of that's due to the fact that we are very much an agrarian community or commonwealth. Much of our economy is based on the ag industry, and but we've also got a large segment of Asian population students that are moving into to the Commonwealth of Kentucky. We are one of the larger automobile manufacturer states in the nation. So, and then for just a quick trivia fact, we also have two cities, one Bowling Green, Western Kentucky University, that happens to be in that community a large refugee center. So we are trying to undertake and challenge, accept this challenge of what can we do to better the education process for our all students, but particularly for students in this growing population of English learners and English learners as, excuse me, a second language. And I really enjoyed listening to the Oregon legislation there, because this is my first year as chair, and we're going to have to do something very similar here in Kentucky. Right now, just so everyone knows where we're at, basically concerning service and support, we do not have a state policy regulating services for preschool EL students or children. Districts can do a lot on their own, Title III coordinators, etc. So a lot of things are left to local districts. Many districts work with migrant programs. Some of you are probably familiar with them. They have some in your state. And many districts have individuals that work throughout their entire school districts. But we have to step up to the plate here in Kentucky, just kind of as a follow-up or response from the previous information, and have the political will to do similar to what Oregon has done. We took on charter schools last session, so we have, of course, which was a tough battle when we were only one of 6 states in the country not to do that. But so we have the political will to make change. And as I made some notes, I guess, on reflection and feedback, and then anybody who would like to respond to these, here are some things that I think that we have to do. And I suspect many states that are on the call are probably in similar shape that Kentucky is in, and we all can learn from Oregon's example. And I want to thank Matt and everyone for having them on. One is, I love the conversation I've heard earlier, I think, from both presentations about measuring growth. I think that has to be the key, particularly as we go through ESSA, is that these students, we have to measure growth, and I love hearing that term. You have to have a strong coalition, and I enjoyed hearing the conversation about the different groups that were involved in the coalition in Oregon, because and I know that every group wasn't listed, but I'm sure it was a vast variety of groups. But you have to have a strong coalition. For me, I believe here in Kentucky, it's vital that we get the business community involved. Like I mentioned earlier, much of our EL population is coming for work, whether it be in the agriculture sector, or in a lot of them in the automobile industry. So we must get the business community involved here, because that's where we can get a lot of political support, I think, to make some of the decisions we're going to have to make, because at the end of the day, it does involve funding. In Oregon, they were talking about the 0.5%. I mean, the 0.5. We have to have more dollars to if we're going to successfully pull off any program. Again, I think a keynote I made here was focus on growth measures, use best practices, and I think some of the work that NCSL has done is going to allow us here in Kentucky and all of us across the country to, I think, make better decisions there. And then I think we have to dedicate the monies that we are able to find, because if you're like we are here in Kentucky, some like Oregon is very similar, a very tough budget coming up this session, but I think those monies need to be dedicated to the early years. I think, again, anybody with some common sense, if we can dedicate it to the early years, it means we're going to save a lot of money on the back end. And then another note I made was must be a bipartisan effort. Again, I believe that our children will respond to how the adults act. And I don't know if that's part of this discussion or not. For me, it is. Again, I think even the youngest of children will respond to how the adults act. And that's why I believe it's vital that this be a bipartisan effort here in Kentucky or wherever. We welcome the challenge, but it is one that is growing every day here in Kentucky. I think we're fifth now on the list of the most rapidly growing states in that population. But again, our current policy is lacking. It's not where it needs to be. Again, most is left up to local districts to provide whatever services they can have with their resources. There is some funding available, but none marked from the Department of Education. Again, we do have some migrant services, but they're more regional than they would be statewide. And that's kind of the existence of our support systems at this point. And we have a lot of work to do here in Kentucky, and I acknowledge that. I hate to say that, but that's the reality. I think that's the biggest issue, I think, is if we don't admit that we've got a problem, then we can't fix it. And we are dedicated, or in Kentucky, we're going to fix this issue because, again, every child deserves an opportunity. And I think that was the one note I left out, I guess, is that much like we had to make the debate discussion somewhat around charters, because I'm a public school teacher who passed a charter school bill, because I believe that everybody learns differently, but it always has to be centered on the child. And whenever we talk about this discussion, this is just from the political standpoint, I guess, because it's going to be a tough fight. I was sharing earlier with some of the panel before everybody else was on. We've got some disagreements between the governor's office of early childhood and the State Department of Education on how best to approach this. So, the rope's not been pulled the same direction already, which is a hurdle we're going to have to overcome. But at the end of the day, we're going to do what's best in Kentucky for our children, and I'm convinced that we have to fund these programs. I would love to personally see each district have the funding to be able to bring in basically a linguistic person to multiple languages to be able to work with their children. And again, obviously, we all know that's not going to be cheap to do that, but again, we cannot allow these children to, because at the end of the day, many of these families, we all know, most of their parents probably don't, struggle, or they probably struggle with English language also, and the children are having to fill in the gaps, so to speak, with some of our district personnel at the district that I work in. And we just started school here 2 weeks ago, and you try to get all the documentation back in, try to get the paperwork back in, and it's usually the older siblings that are having to take the burden over and close the gap between particularly preschool or second, third grade students and the parents. You usually have an older sibling that's having to assist and plug the gap with all the questionnaires and et cetera. So this is not only an early childhood issue. Most times, at least in our community, it will bleed on up to a parental issue. So, but that's where we're at in Kentucky. I hope I'm bringing some things that some of you relate to in your states, but at the end of the day, I think you have to be clear with your message. You have to have a strong coalition, and one, you can't take no for an answer, because these children have to have these opportunities.
Great. Thank you, Representative Carney, for your comments, and thank you to our presenters today. I think we've given everyone a lot to think about. And just to be respectful of everyone's time, I'm going to pass it over to Allison May to kind of close the webinar with a couple of logistic comments.
Well, thank you so much to everyone on the line today and for sticking with us. As you mentioned earlier, an archived copy of the webinar will be available shortly on our website, and we'll also send an email around so that you can re-listen or share it with colleagues that you think might find the topic interesting to the work that they're doing. And finally, just a reminder to complete the evaluation, which is going to pop up on your computer screen at the conclusion of the webinar. We do take your feedback seriously, so please give us a few moments of your time and fill it out. On the page, you'll see some contact information for Matt and I. NCSL is here for you, so if you have any questions about this particular webinar or others, feel free to reach out to us via email or phone. We'd love to hear from you. And for the Early Learning Fellows that are currently on the line, Matt and I look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks here in Denver, Colorado for our final meeting. Thanks a lot, and have a great afternoon.